Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. The news will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. Those were the first few lines of Edgar Allan Poe's 1849 obituary. By this time, Poe was already a notable literary figure, gaining immense popularity with his poem, The Raven, published just 4 years before he died. So who would want to slander such a popular literary figure? And once more, who would want to go to such lengths as to slander a dead man? To get to the heart of that, we have to look at the author of Poe's obituary, signed simply as Ludwig and printed in the New York Tribune. Ludwig, as it turned out, was a pseudonym because the author was afraid of retaliation. As he admitted in a letter to Poe's former fiancée Sarah Whitman, he stated, "I was not his friend, nor was he mine." Nevertheless, the damage was already done, and Poe's obituary would go on to be widely distributed. But Poe's enemy wasn't done yet. First, let's expose the man behind Ludwig. So that man was actually Rufus Griswold, who at the time was a failed Baptist minister, turned editor, critic, and poet. Poe and Griswold met around 1841 and seemed to have a tenuous professional friendship, but it's most likely that Griswold sort of saw Poe as this uneducated phony, while Poe probably saw Griswold as a person who had succeeded not by the merits of his writing, but rather his social connections. Since Griswold was the editor of various poetry anthologies, he and Poe most likely encountered each other on a professional and personal basis many times. It was actually one of these poetry anthologies, The Poets and Poetry of America, that most likely became the boiling point between the two writers. Poe had told numerous people that he thought Griswold's talents as an editor were overblown. In fact, he was known to state that The Poets and Poetry of America was a most outrageous humbug. Interestingly enough, a most outrageous humbug would become the title of a theatrical play about Poe's life and would include the theme of Poe being driven to an early grave by none other than his rival, Rufus Griswold. However, Poe was still a notable literary figure, and Griswold wanted Poe to basically write him a review of Poets and Poetry in America. Poe agreed, but only if he was paid a fee in advance. And so Griswold paid this fee, and Poe did write a review of the book that was mostly favorable. But the interesting thing is that Poe would later on go on to say that Griswold's fee was basically a bribe, and it was one that he happily exploited from Griswold. But Poe wasn't done with Griswold's book. In fact, in an anonymous review published in a Philadelphia paper, the book was referred to in a less than favorable light. In fact, the words of the review stated, "Did anyone read such nonsense? The authors not included should be gratified at their non-appearance in the volume. For if ever such a thing as literary ruin existed, it's ruined forever by the praise of Mr. Griswold." Shots fired. The two would go on to encounter each other in various literary circles, and they would still kind of throw shade at each other, with Griswold stating that Poe's basically only merit was in his dissection of sentences as an editor, while Poe would continue to chip away at Griswold's poetry anthology, even going as far as to circulate a sort of small satiric pamphlet making fun of the book. But just 2 years later, Poe would be found dead on a park bench in Baltimore. Now would be Griswold's time to shine. He penned Poe's obituary stating, among other things, that Poe had no friends, that he was destitute, that he was pale and ghastly, that he walked the streets in madness, and all sorts of less than nice things. The obituary would go on to establish Poe's reputation as a sort of literary lunatic for years to come. But Griswold still wasn't done. He would go on to secure the rights to a posthumous collection of Poe's works, where he kept all the profits. He then went on to write a memoir of Poe's life, which continued to slander Poe. He basically said that Poe deserted the army, that he blackmailed other writers, and Griswold even forged letters from Poe to alienate Poe from his former friends. And this was the only biography of Poe that was available for around 20 years after he died. In fact, it was the most well-known biography of Poe till around 1879. Just 8 years after Poe's death, Griswold would find himself on his own deathbed, dying of tuberculosis in 1857. Interestingly enough, a person who went into Griswold's room found documents on his desk that Griswold had been preparing for publication, basically attacking other authors. Another interesting tidbit was that the sole decorations in Griswold's room were pictures of himself, Frances Osgood, a woman that he and Poe had shared a mutual infatuation for, and pictures of Edgar Allan Poe himself. So what can we as modern authors and writers learn from the rivalry between Griswold and Poe? Perhaps it's just to be kind and not slander one another, especially in death. After all, Griswold was finally buried in 1865 without a headstone, while Poe's grave is said to be one of the most popular and celebrated tourist attractions in Baltimore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. This has been Plot to Print. If you enjoyed this little history rundown, we sure did. Give us a like and subscribe, and we will see you on the next one. Thanks so much.